So, one of the most eagerly anticipated titles for the holiday season this year is Halo Infinite, and while we still haven't seen much more on the campaign side of things, Microsoft has started to roll out its second technical flight, concentrating on multiplayer gameplay. Tons to discuss here, some interesting improvements from the first flight, which we've already covered, and joining me to talk about it, it's none other than Alex Battaglia.
Hey there, Rich. I was covering the PC for this second flight here, and you have taken point on all the console versions, essentially, right?
Yeah, which basically means we'll be looking at quality and performance modes on Xbox Series X and Xbox One X, and there's just one mode on the other systems. But yeah, still lots to talk about here. But to begin with, let's talk about the actual makeup of the flight, because there was actually a lot more content this time around, and some interesting additional modes. So there was bot fights, there was weapons ranges for targeting high scores, stuff like that. So yeah, there was basically the opportunity to access Halo Infinite outside of the scheduled multiplayer time slots.
I actually spent a lot of my time on PC just playing the same 3 maps that we had technically from the last flight, which was Bazaar, Live Fire, and Recharge. Live Fire is the one that they first brought out for the last flight, and the one we first saw, and it was, I would say, a less than positive first impression, because it was a rather kind of boring looking map in general. It's kind of gray, a little bit of greens and browns in there, and then like a jet kind of gray color to the rest of the environment. Less than positive. But Bazaar, for example, which they included at the end of the last flight, is kind of straight out of Halo 2 in terms of its aesthetic, and it looks a lot like Halo 2's Anniversary Edition, for example. A lot of the aesthetics we see in that there, and I thought it was really good.
Absolutely.
This time around, though, they also brought out a larger map, which is the first time we're seeing, I would say, more Halo 1 or Halo 3 scaled maps in this new engine here, and it's called Behemoth, and it was pretty interesting to look at.
Okay, so yeah, this is quite interesting because it's a completely different aesthetic to the other maps. Basically, I guess the big thing is that it's a wide open desert style area. Lots of direct lighting, but also interesting lighting interactions between the Forerunner structures and the environments.
The big question ever since last year, when I did that critique video about what I thought was wrong with the initial showing of Halo Infinite, and I focused a lot on lighting and indirect lighting. Here in this multiplayer map, there's a large structure in the middle, kind of like straight out of Halo 3 actually. And this structure is made almost entirely of a very dull Forerunner metal. And when you look at any of these metals here in the darkness, you can actually see that there is some sort of indirect specular lighting on them. And it looks actually quite okay. And it's a bit surprising because this was one of the main critique points I had back in my video last year in August or so. And it seems to be remedied, at least for this multiplayer map, where if you look at this Forerunner structure, you can actually see some really nice indirect lighting on it, outside of screen space. There's a lot of nice screen space reflections, something I praised last time we talked about this, something you can see really well on that map Recharge, for example, which is kind of indoor sci-fi. It basically relies on the great usage of screen space reflections. But on Behemoth, where screen space stuff doesn't work as well, they actually do have some form of GI in here that shows up really well, and I'm curious how it'll play out for the final game in the campaign mode, which won't have static lighting like we see on all these multiplayer maps, and it'll be interesting to see if it's a similar system but dynamic or something else entirely. But this is a good showing, at least. We're actually getting to see this GI in action now.
Yeah, really interesting showing generally, actually. And personally, I was a bit disappointed that my favourite bot, 343 Salt Baron, was nowhere to be found, but it was more than made up for with the arrival of 343 Doomfruit.
These remind me of a lot of the automatically generated gamer tags back in the Xbox 360 era. Like Scooter Loop and I don't know, all those really dumb names, but yeah, they're pretty awesome.
Okay, so let's talk about the version breakdown here, because I did look at all of the consoles and all of the modes, and in some respects there isn't much to say in addition to what we talked about previously, but elsewhere there have been some profound improvements, I think. Let's sort of tick off the less interesting stuff first. I'm going to talk about Xbox One S first of all, which is kind of like, well, it is the least capable console in the lineup, and compromises have had to be made. So we're still not getting screen space reflections, the ground deformation is pared back. The resolution, temporal reconstruction up to 1080p, 1080p max, but the resolution can go down really low.
We've pointed out before the last time we talked about this title, but it'll first start scaling on the one axis, usually horizontal, I'm pretty sure. And then after it hits some point, I don't know how arbitrarily it is set, you'll also start seeing scaling on the vertical axis. In less busy moments, you'll just see horizontal scaling, but when the action picks up, you'll see something going down to some, like, I don't know, 810 by 900 as we counted as the minimum. Tom was on point for those counts here.
I mean, it could go lower. I think the first flight did. But yeah, it's almost like an approximation of the game that you're playing on the series consoles in a way, because the shading can look really, really rough. But something that is also kind of curious about this second flight is that we saw some shadow maps that were present on all versions of the game except Xbox One S. That was in the initial flight. But in this flight, it seems to be the case that those shadow maps are gone on all systems. So there is a closer level of parity there, at least. It was the most striking difference, certainly from a graphical makeup perspective, beyond the frame rate and resolution stuff. But performance is still the same, 30 frames per second. The frame pacing is still problematic. It sort of varies between 16 millisecond, 33, 50. It doesn't feel like a proper 30 frames per second. But, you know, ultimately, it is Halo Infinite. It is playable. You are getting 30 frames per second, but it's just not an optimal experience.
This is honestly, though, kind of what we wished for last year after we had our discussion concerning the first showing of Halo Infinite's campaign, where we kind of wanted the 1S version to not be very good because it would mean that they had to put in a lot of extra graphical flair into the higher end versions, which would mean, you know, 1S would necessarily take a hit. So in the end, I'm kind of happy it's targeting 30 FPS on 1S. Yes, it's less playable, but I'm kind of happy that it is in that spot. One thing I would really like them to look at, if they can, is the frame pacing issue, because we don't like bad frame pacing at Digital Foundry. And, you know, other Halo games in the past have solved this. Maybe this time around, it's just hitting the GPU and CPU too hard here on 1S, so maybe it isn't solvable.
Yep, quite possibly. Let's move on to the Series S next. This is 1080p, again, dynamic resolution scaling. It works in a similar way to the other console builds, where vertical and horizontal do seem to be independent, with a bias to the horizontal, but I'll be honest with you, it's really hard to actually find any drops from native 1080p here. So it looks 1080p, it looks fine, and I don't think we should really spend too much time talking about performance, because essentially it's a non-issue, as you'd expect, locked to 60 frames per second pretty much from start to finish. But what is kind of strange is that in the first flight we did have a 120 Hertz mode, but that's completely gone on this second flight. I don't know why, maybe because the resolution really was hit really hard when you use that mode. Hopefully it will come back, because 120 FPS is great.
John really loved that mode the first flight, when the Series X back then in its 120 Hertz mode was less stable. So, you know, I do actually hope they bring it back. Maybe it may not make it for the campaign. That's hard to always say, but I really think it's perfect for multiplayer.
Absolutely. So let's move on now to Xbox Series X, where in some respects it's the same old, but in others there have been dramatic improvements. So in the first flight there were performance and quality toggles, but they didn't seem to do anything. But you could switch between 60 Hz and 120 Hz gaming with the dashboard setting. So that toggle now works, but only if you have the console set to 120. So if you're on quality mode, it will top out at 60 frames per second. If you're in performance mode, it will run at 120. There was a bug in this beta, which is that if you had the game set to performance mode and you started a game, it would swap back to quality and you'd have to manually swap it back. Even though it said it was running in performance mode, it wasn't. But, you know, that's a simple bug. I'm sure they'll fix it. We'll talk quickly about the quality mode, because there's really not much to say about it, because it's dynamic 4K at 60 frames per second. 3840 by 2160 at the maximum, 2880 by 1800 minimum. Again, with those variations in horizontal and vertical scaling, but I think this just looks pretty awesome. And again, similar to Series S, 60 frames per second is 60 frames per second. I mean, there are very, very occasional one-off drops. I can't say I noticed them during the flow of play, just came up in the analysis here. But the performance mode, that's where things get interesting, because as John noted in our first video on this, 120Hz needed some work, and the good news is it's had that work.
Great. It's actually locking to 120 FPS now, which is great for a multiplayer title. We always want to see this at Digital Foundry, essentially allowing people to use their 120 hertz screens for multiplayer gaming. And for Halo Infinite, a game that is an arena shooter, this actually adds a lot to the gaming experience. From what you were seeing here, though, it does have to drop resolution to do that. It's not going to be able to target a full 4K presentation, but it still looks rather good. The max resolution we were really finding was around 1440p, and lower values were having that kind of horizontal vertical scaling differences, a lowest count being 1664 by 1134. So around 1080p-ish, but also scaled differently. I'm kind of a fan of scaling the horizontal axis in games because you notice it a lot less than vertical scales, I think, usually. So I think this is actually a good compromise.
Yeah, so in the first flight, there was quite a lot of 1080p, and we couldn't actually find a 1080p shot from our samples this time around. And, it did go up to 1440. And I think something else which is quite interesting here is that the capture you're seeing here, we actually used a capture card at 1440p here. And 1440p is 1440p native on a 1440p screen. No double scaling there. So I think overall this is one of the big takeaways, which is that performance mode was looking a little bit dodgy in the first flight, but it's looking seriously impressive now. Occasional single frame drops, but you really don't notice it in the run of play. And yeah, for me, across the weekend, this was my preferred way to play.
How about the Xbox One X version though? Because last time it also had performance and quality modes, but they didn't really seem to do anything.
They didn't do anything. You could select between them, but nothing happened. But it's all change, Alex. This is really good news. So quality mode is essentially a rerun of the first flight. And we're looking at 30 frames per second. Again, there are some minor inconsistencies with frame pacing, but it's nowhere near as problematic as it is on Xbox One S. Nice 1800p to 2160p dynamic resolution scaling.
Not bad.
So yeah, it is comparable with Xbox Series X from a graphical quality perspective. It's just at 30 frames per second rather than 60 frames per second. And that is a bit of a problem because frame rate is so key to a great first-person shooter, right? But that's where the performance mode comes in, because it does actually work now. And it's 60 frames per second, which is a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. To quote Chancellor Palpatine.
Yeah, this is pretty awesome, and it's actually unexpected because we were thinking that for Halo Infinite that they would be targeting 60 FPS on next gen only, and they'd be using that greater headroom on the CPUs there. But apparently, even Xbox One X with its Jaguar core in comparison to the original Xbox One and Xbox One S Jaguar cores, that's enough for 60 in the multiplayer, and it does a heck of a lot here. The performance, though, in 60 FPS mode, in this performance mode, does it hold up?
Perceptually, it's absolutely fine. You can see on the frame rate graph that there are drops into the high 50s, but I had a great time with it, and it's a gigantic improvement over the 30 FPS mode. It's, proper Halo Infinite. This is the way you want to play the game. Even though there is that resolution drop, that's likely a 1080p minimum. There were counts above that. 1440p is the maximum. And there's actually been some interesting discussion here because, in theory, we're looking at a game that's outperforming Series S. Not outperforming, the frame rate isn't as solid, but you're getting higher quality textures, you're getting a higher resolution. It looks like some of the terrain deformation is slightly more enhanced on One X as well. So interesting to compare the two, but I'm just kind of happy that One X is being fully utilized here, right?
We haven't seen this too often. Usually we see the split where Series S gets a 60 FPS mode that is impossible on One X. Maybe this is the last hurrah for the Xbox One X console, where it produces a version that's absolutely awesome and maybe in some ways better than that Series S. One thing I'm curious though is that in larger games like Big Team Battle, which has yet to be released, I think that's in the next weekend's test, but I'm curious if the Xbox One X's CPU has enough juice to hold up its 60 hertz in that kind of larger multiplayer mode. That's one thing I'm really curious about.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to be interested to see whether it holds up. I mean, slight dips into the 50s at the moment, but it just feels like, as I said, proper Halo. So whether it could actually sustain that with max players, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I do think, though, that we're more likely to see the campaign still pegged at 30 because, running an open world and stuff. I'd love to see it run at 60, but I can't see it happening.
I don't really see that as possible as well.
Okay, so look, that's the lie of the land on all of the consoles at the moment, and just generally I think it was a fantastic weekend, and the console versions are really looking pretty awesome, especially on Series X. That really is just a complete package there. But in theory, we should be seeing even better things on the PC version, but the complaints we had in the first technical flight do not appear to have been addressed, and I think it's probably worth your while to go through the issues that you encountered in depth and to get that information out there, and hopefully it will be addressed for the final game.
Yeah, so here what I'm going to do is basically spend about 5 minutes complaining about the PC version. So take that what you will. This has been essentially, I want to get this information out there. I want 343 to see this, because if these things are fixed, the PC version is going to be better in the end. Unlike the console version, there weren't really changes to the performance or the quirks that we saw between the first flight and this second flight. So the first thing I want to focus on is the in-game VSync and FPS limiter. So if you want to use the in-game VSync, which I think a lot of people do, you usually want to use in-game VSync if you can. Native VSync is the best thing. If you turn that on, you automatically have to use the in-game frame rate limiter. And for example, on a 60 Hz screen, that means it'll make you use the 60 FPS limiter on PC. Problem is that 60 FPS limiter is not actually limiting the game to 60 FPS. It's like 57 or 58, maybe 59. I don't know, it kind of wobbles a bit, but basically if you use in-game VSync, you are always going to see the frame rate fluctuating, just spinning the camera. You're seeing essentially every 1 second a frame drop or so, or even more. It's very bad looking, and if people are playing this game for the first time and they're loading it up on a normal VSync display, they're going to have a bad time, and they're going to think there's something wrong with the game, when it's actually the problem with the frame rate limiter. If you limit the game externally, for example, with VSync from your graphics driver, that works just fine. So you can get a properly VSynced 60 FPS or VSynced 120 FPS or 144 FPS externally, but I don't think that should be a solution. In-game stuff should always work. Another problem that I noticed here as well is that targeting frame rates above 60 FPS was impossibly hard on PC. I noticed this the last time in the last flight, but here I'm showing a Core i9-10900K running with an RTX 3090, complete overkill. I'm running on the lowest settings possible, by the way, at 1440p here. This recording's 1080p though. And you'll notice that I've brought up NVIDIA graphics analysis stuff because RTSS, I did not want to run it with this game because I heard it was having issues. So I brought that up, and you can see that the GPU utilization is very low. In spite of that, running around this completely empty map here, devoid of bots or anything, the frame rate is nowhere near 120 FPS. So something in Halo Infinite in this current build is not allowing the GPU hardware to be properly utilized, which I hope this doesn't happen in the end product, because we would have this weird situation where you can have a flawless 120 FPS on consoles, and PC is kind of like not that great. Now, the last issue, I'm pretty sure this will affect all versions of the game from the footage I've seen so far, but there is some weird stuff going on with the animation frame rate. So the game's frame rate can be fine at 60 FPS like you see in this footage here, but picking up a weapon or reloading a weapon or clambering across a piece of terrain, your character grabs the terrain and lifts themselves up, the frame rate of these things happening does not actually line up with the frame rate the game is producing, which makes the animation look jittery and lower frame rate than it really is. It makes the game essentially look decidedly less smooth. It's not always doing that, but it does it more often than I would like, and this makes the game seem a lot less fluid than it ought to be. And I thought, this is an issue that we saw in the past with other Halo games that are legacy, but it is actually genuinely surprising to see it here in a game, architected around running at variable frame rates. So that is something they definitely need to watch out for in the final version of this game. So I'm not talking about this again on release, and instead talking about other things, hopefully positive things. But that's really all I have to say about the PC version. It looks great at the moment, but I'm really concerned about these basic issues currently not being fixed.
I didn't really look at animation on consoles as in-depth as you did, but it is pretty clear that Series X here at 120 Hz is running 60 frames per second animations. I think it is worth bearing in mind, actually, that following that comprehensive critique, I do think that fundamentally this is Halo back on track, certainly on the console side of things, in terms of the offering, in terms of the gameplay, in terms of the action. I mean, I was locked to the consoles all weekend here. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant technical flight, and I hugely enjoyed what 343 have delivered here. Really looking forward to the final game. And I guess really it's all about the campaign now, right? Because this is where our hearts really are, and this is where 343 have still been keeping their powder dry.
Yeah, they haven't really talked about it yet. There's a lot of things that are still open questions. We've seen great improvements in visuals here in regards to the multiplayer, but the single player is a completely different beast in terms of the scale and the fact that it's a real-time time of day happening. So there's a lot of open questions there, but based upon what we're seeing here, at least on the console side of things, I think it should shape up to be something good. I just want to see it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's really all we've got to say about Halo Infinite at the moment. There is that second weekend of flight access, and hopefully the big teams variant will be available. And I can't wait to play that. And if there is more to say on that, then we shall indeed produce a video on it, because, Halo Infinite is just awesome. Okay, well, thanks for joining me on this one, Alex.
As always, Rich.
And yes, if you enjoyed the content, please do like, subscribe, share. Ring the bell, of course, for those notionally instant notifications whenever we post new content on the channel. But you do need to be subscribed first. So, yeah. DF Supporter Program. Join us for pristine quality downloads of everything we do, access to our Discord server, early access to DF Direct Weekly, and a ton of really awesome stuff. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.